So that felt a little longer than normal that time. Hey, how's it
The
going, everybody?
explosion was nice, too.
Yep, got to bring it in right. But yeah, thanks for joining us, everyone. As you can see, I am joined here with Tim Schulz today, CEO, co-founder of Starseer. I will not hog all of his bandwidth. If you guys haven't heard of him before, I'll let him do a quick intro.
Thanks, Trey. So that's what, as we were saying before, we were talking about a little bit on pre-show was, it's been a little while since I've been on a Threat Thursday. So, long time, listeners might recognize me from my time at Scythe. But yeah, now I've gone and started a company doing AI security. And yeah, for anyone else that hasn't either seen me before or anything like that, I started the AI red team at Verizon right after my role at Scythe. And then I spent quite a few years at Scythe, did the whole MITRE attack essentially stint, and also kind of started my career at Sandia National Labs. So it's a little bit of a time travel backwards there, but have mostly focused on sort of, we'll say, test and evaluation, emerging tech research areas. So excited to be here today and talk about some of my favorite subjects.
Yeah, so that makes for a good segue. So on the calendar, we were talking AI in the threat landscape. And there's a ton of different ways we can go with this. Which one do we want to start with? I know we chit-chatted a little bit.
Yeah,
It's
let's
all
kick off with the thing everyone's like been inundated with is mythos, right? Like
yeah,
right, it's is this world-ending thing for cybersecurity, or is it, I've also seen like other takes that it's like, okay, this is actually the end of, the beginning of the end for offense, because now defenders are going to have all of these things. And there's been a ton of hype around it. It has been heavily marketed by everybody under the sun, even outside of Anthropic. So let's just start there. I feel like let's kick off with that.
this is a really interesting one because it seems to be in everybody's threat landscape right now, from the lowliest individual all the way up to the White House itself. Because I know they were just putting out an article today projecting them to push an executive order directing a lot of kind of safe testing and other kind of evaluation of AIs, because mostly centered around mythos and kind of the noise it's made. So this is an interesting one. I'm surprised it's lasted this long as a normal hype cycle, right?
Yeah, I think that's where I think part of the reason is there's been essentially an embargo on what is allowed to be talked about. So you have all of these parts of the community that are part of Project Glasswing. There's been sort of this set of rules around what can be disclosed. Anthropic, in theory, is loosening some of these to allow people to talk about it more. But I think that has sort of contributed to it, where you have lots of people weighing in. There's not a lot of actual real data out there, and we're sort of getting trickles of streams of things that are coming out, like the Firefox bug count and things like that. But I think at that's why I think that it's just lasted this long. And there's varying reports, and I think we can get into some of these different things. But I think one of the things that really has, when people talk about mythos, is this step function of oh my gosh, I like to call back to what feels like an eternity ago, which is less than a year. It's I don't know, what would be 10 months at this point, of DEF CON and the sort of grand challenge, DARPA grand challenge, that everyone seems to have sort of forgotten about, which understandable considering how much has happened since then. But if you think about where model capabilities were a year ago, and they're still very impressive, but I think no one saw it as this autonomous hacking thing that was sort of coming for all of the cybersecurity industry. And if you go and look at the results, and some of the things that came out of that was essentially harnesses, cyber specific harnesses, agentic systems that were focused around vulnerability hunting, vulnerability exploitation, patching, things like that. Big competition. There was, at the time, it was making some amount of noise, but I think there was also AI hadn't hit the mainstream groups yet. And I think even within cybersecurity, the question was, is AI actually going to meet any of the hype that has sort of come up about it? So I think like those teams were like accomplishing like amazing results with much, much, dumber models, air quotes around that. And so like they were still very capable frontier models. But I think that is the thing that I like to point out, because the like common thread on like, all right, how far do open weights or open source and models like lag behind the frontier? And so most of the numbers come around to like 8 to 12 months. And so if we look and we're like, all right, 8 to 12 months back, we were already doing this with frontier models at the time. And now Mythos has just made it so I think the ease of use, you probably don't need to give it in a very long prompt. You don't need as much orchestration potentially. I think that might be a step change. But I think overall the capabilities of hooking up some of these models with people that understand how to use them, that have sort of expertise in that area, I think that's why there's sort of this mixed bucket of reactions, where from not surprised to, oh my gosh, the whole industry is going to be flipped upside down.
I think it has been very interesting, but at the end of the day, these are still just tools. It's an interesting position to be in because, yeah, like you said, you've either got one side that's like, it's just one more thing, or the other that's like, the sky is falling, nobody's going to have jobs, X, Y, and Z. And to an extent, like I can see that if you're in very specific or niche roles, yeah, you might have a problem. But for anyone and everyone, the whole market, no, I don't think that's the case either. The model piece of this is actually interesting. We were talking about this a little bit, and how that timeline from like, oh, there's this new hype wave, this new thing that a frontier model can do, to all of a sudden a local model is capable in a couple months. And it seems like that window is shrinking more and more. Like the Gemma models are a great example of that, right? I know you've been playing with those for a bit.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think what's really interesting is like, to me, like that's where for anyone that's, run local models, and if you haven't, like that's completely okay. Like there's this depending on how big of a computer or setup you have, this is always one of those questions of like, all right, like how big of a machine do I need in order to run something that is like frontier class or was frontier class? Like, and I think that's one of the things that like the new Gemma models from Google have actually been very, very good. Like overall, they've been very intelligent. I've told a couple people around, I feel like it's kind of like a frontier-ish capability from like probably like 6 to 8 months ago. The more important thing though is how small of a model it's packaged in, which is something that allows for fitting onto a MacBook Pro, for instance. And that's something that like we haven't really seen before, like that level of intelligence to be available, something like so locally and quickly. And that's where I think when you start getting to the bigger models, your DeepSeek, some of those really big models coming out of, China and stuff like that, that's where like we're seeing more and more like R&D go into some of that stuff. That being said, everyone is constrained by access to compute power, right? Whether even if you are using one of the hyperscalers, like stuff is sold out. And like, I mean, Microsoft just came out and said that I don't know if it's for the first time, but for one of the first times that in this, we'll say hype cycle, they have like new chips from NVIDIA sitting in boxes that they cannot plug in because they don't have the data centers built. They don't have the power required to run some of these things. So I think that we are going to see like somewhat of this, like, I think there's going to be a couple of different factors. One, I do think the frontier models providers will be able to stay ahead, but I think there's extreme caveats to that. I think the price of access for those is going to continue to rise significantly, such that the cheap access that we've all been used to for the past like couple years is really starting to come to an end. And so the question is going to be, do you want to pay absurd prices, or like, is the work that you're doing something that you can start doing that sort of business calculus where, hey, it is worth it for us to pay for access to this? Or are you going to say, you know what, we can actually run this on a MacBook, or we can buy some like maybe a dedicated, I just think of like the older days of like password cracking machines, except it's going to be, we're seeing this already, right? As sort of a local model lab setup. But I think especially small businesses and product teams are going to start doing this more and more. So and I think that ecosystem of running local models is still very fragmented. So I see that like rapidly maturing very quickly.
Yeah, and I think that kind of brings up a couple different things that a lot of people aren't taking into their threat landscape. Because I mean, in the end, dollar bucks affects what you can do from a security perspective, right? Right now, it's cheap, it's easy. You can replace your low, maybe mid-level like engineers or analysts or things like that with a frontier model because you're paying what, a couple $100 a month per seat realistically for them to do the thing, depending on who you're using as an org or how you're running in your business size. Well, when this scale flips and all of a sudden that turns to 2,000 or 10,000 or, it's an X multiplier because now they need to recoup that cost of compute because there's only so much of it available. What
Yes.
does that look like for these businesses that have now hedged their entire business or product line or whatever they're doing on that frontier model with no investment in hardware or an ability to do it themselves locally? It's like, okay, now are you going to continue to spend that money looking forward, or are you going to start slowly replacing that frontier model again with another engineer at a higher cost now?
Yes, I definitely like to help illustrate. I think some of like how much this is going to be a crunch, like because I do think it's going to be uneven across a bunch of things. Is that you're going to have like people like Anthropic are like right now constantly like in the news almost daily now trying to make more deals to get access to more compute. They just did a deal with SpaceX to get access to Colossus One, which is the data center that's built out in Memphis. And they just announced last night that they are expanding that partnership to also do Colossus 2, like to do some portion of it. So those are really the only big like clusters of compute that are not like pre-sold or like have been available. And I think the challenge is what we're seeing from like what Anthropic and some of those places are seeing from a growth perspective is like they had talked about, sort of planning for up to 10x growth. And that if you annualize what's happened in Q1, they hit 80x growth. And so AI has really gone more mainstream in that sense. But the like amount of when we start talking about like less from just chatbots and more moving to like agents, right? The things that people and businesses are looking for to actually go and like do a task for me, right? Because that's the thing that helps generate more value. It's doing that sort of autonomous task, and whether it's going and doing research, whether it's automating workflows that are a little bit more dynamic. Those types of things are really where businesses are seeing the value. But also that's where the cost, because all right, now it's not one turn back and forth. It's all right, 15 turns, it's 30 turns, it's pulling sources from the internet, which now you need to secure. And so those are the types of things that when you look at like all of the security training and safety training that we've done for people, there's not really the mature ecosystem for AI agents and things like that. So there's a lot of risks around that, and that's where right now the frontier model providers through that single chat interface that we all use have made it like very easy to just like use these systems. But the challenge is as that cost rises, then it becomes much more of a okay, like what's it going to take to do this on-prem? And I do think you're exactly right. We are going to see that there's a lot of automation and jobs that people assumed that we could automate and it was going to be cheaper are not actually going to be something like, even if you can build a system around it, you need somebody to have maintenance on it. And if that is like essentially a system that you have to build internally because it's either you for a specific cybersecurity use case, for a specific like business product use case, you now have maintenance, you have technicians, you have all of those things that you have to do to make sure that that system keeps running. So it will require hiring or bringing some people back because you can't just have agents fixing agents. We're not there yet.
Yeah, the good analogy I've always used, I kind of equate it back to the whole boom of robotics and kind of the way we use those things in building cars. Like you went from people by hand putting cars together, doing pieces of parts, turning wrenches, all of that fun stuff, and doing quality checks, to all of a sudden robotics got good enough to where you could have them piece and part and build a car together for you. Well, those jobs had to go somewhere, right? So those people just went from doing the manual labor of the work to now they're maintaining and managing the robotics pieces.
Mhm.
It's the same thing happening here. The interesting thing too is I think there's another correlation between any major market shift we've seen like this is it's always get to market, right? Get there first, get there fast, put out something cool. We'll fix it and secure it on the back end,
Yes.
which we're very much already seeing the effects of that happening just in these last few months with all of the different kind of supply chain attacks that are happening. It's become a huge attack surface.
Mhm.
And it's even something that Verizon brought up in their DBIR is like shadow AI now, not just shadow IT is one of those kind of big, really fast growing insider risks, right? Is, well,
Mhm.
companies not paying me to do this. They're not giving me the access I need. So I'm just putting it in my own personal subscription to whatever I'm doing. So now we're leaking potential intellectual property or customer data or just dev information out into these models when realistically it shouldn't be there. So there's a lot going on in this little bitty space right now.
Oh, completely agree. And I like a point I want to highlight too about that insider risk stuff that you sort of talked about. I think that's one of the things where like without pulling too many external factors in, like they do matter. Because for instance, we've seen lots of layoffs, right, in the tech industry.
Mhm.
And so at that point where there's this sort of fear going throughout workers and people that are trying to execute on their job, right? If there's concern that they may lose their job if they're not, performing up to a certain par, or that, they can get a leg up or ahead by using an AI tool, even if it's not approved, like this environment is kind of almost incentivizing that, just because people are that concerned. And I think that's the piece where there's a lot of like challenges with trust in AI, like overall, right? Can I trust the output? Can I trust the things? And that's the place that I feel like, especially with the sort of just, all right, we know AI is going to be something. We've seen businesses just essentially write blank checks for like 2 years, right? Of like, hey, we're going to
Mhm.
experiment, we're going to do this, we're going to cut security out, we're going to sideline it. And but I really mark one of the big turning points is open claw, right? And that was one of the and and we've seen all of these changes now over the past couple months where people are starting to bring security and legal in a lot more, because that was one of the things that really illustrated one how useful AI could be, right? If you hook it up to all of the things, you can essentially task it from your phone, even if it requires desktop resources, stuff like that. And we've seen those features kind of permeate to all of the codecs
Mhm.
and Claude code and that kind of thing. But I think the other piece of it is it really illustrated the risks around it, because now agents are going and doing things autonomously, and some of the failure modes, like this has always been one of the cases that like
Yep.
folks in AI security have talked about at length, was like it was much harder to prove like just drastic impact when you're just chatting with a model and that's it and they can't do anything. And then we added internet connectivity and we have multi steps, and then it's pulling data from like internal databases and stuff like that.
Has
Like
access to your mailbox.
yes, your email, right? And it's like it makes it more useful, but because of that it can have higher positive impact. It also means it can have higher negative impact. And I think that is an under like that's just how those things go. And that's what OpenClaw really showed for us, was like it helped make that point crystal clear across the industry that the current set of security solutions are not actually like able to deal with the current state of threats. And I mean the current state of threats in this case being somebody going and putting a jailbreak, in essentially a Reddit post. Somebody that gave instructions on don't delete emails, but then like, and this was one of the famous examples that was
Yep.
literally from somebody who's the head of alignment at Meta. So like her job is around making sure that AI agents do what they're supposed to do. And essentially what happened is, right, when you start talking to and whether it's a model, an agent, whatever your workflow, right, it keeps growing in length. And so one of the challenges is as you add more context, and that context is kind of like filling up the AI agents, like we'll say RAM or current brain. And one of the methods for essentially freeing up some of that when it hits the limit, instead of just stopping chatting with you, which some of the AI providers just do that, is it compresses it. And so what it did was it compressed rules that said, do not, delete my email. And so that was what happened, is essentially that rule got compressed and removed. And then, the agent decided, hey, I need to clean some stuff up, and went and started deleting emails. And she had to run and go and unplug, the computer that it was running on. So like, those are the things that I don't know that we, like, enterprises, I think, saw some of those failures and were like, holy crap, like this is could be a serious problem. Like, there's potentially big gains here, but there is some serious risk, and we need to actually maybe slow down just a little bit to understand how do we start, like, actually looking at this from a security perspective. Because shadow AI, in this case, if you're running OpenClaw, if a bunch of people are running it, it can have drastic impact at essentially machine speed across your organization. And I think that's just something that there hasn't been that sort of, smart enough brain, right, in some of these things to go and orchestrate that level of, impact before.
And it's really like uncharted territory right now. We're trying to rework everything we know about security around AI. It's like the DLP again is a great example of this, right? In the best of times, it's already extremely difficult to do and almost impossible to do well. So now you just gave one more vector for people to potentially leak data or take data or introduce some way to utilize it to make data go where it's not supposed to. And from a defensive side, there's not really a lot of detections or a lot of really good frameworks or anything around these behaviors right now from a threat perspective. And this is something I know me and you have talked about at length, is like, we can just go and, instead of doing full enumeration now and like digging for loot and all kinds of craziness, you just go look at one directory and you get almost everything you need as a threat actor, right?
Yeah.
So it's a very, very weird time we're in that in between.
Yeah, I think we've it's definitely one of those things where it's like chat history and all those things have become a gold mine, right, for it. And it, again, like, I think we're still trying to, like, societally, and as the market, trying to figure out what is that threat profile that's a balance between what is the AI model, like, stores about me or about some of our conversations, that continues to make it useful, so it's not having to relook up something every time, right? Whether it's a bunch of internet searches or things like that. So again, it comes down to this trade-off of how useful is what I'm getting versus the risk associated with that. And I think that is not well understood. I think the attack surface is still evolving. I mean, like you mentioned, supply chain attacks these are things, though, that, and this is what I always like to bring up, is like, these are problems that we as an industry have had for a while. Same with Mythos, like being able to find all these vulnerabilities and some of that stuff. And I think the challenge becomes, what is what has now changed that makes those things a priority? And maybe that's like a Mythos class, model helps illustrate the point of what supply chain and, like, vulnerabilities in code, like, do. But for instance, like, SAST and DAST, right? Source code auditing tools have existed for a long time. They're typically very good. And sometimes that's why teams don't like to run them, is, right, they start unearthing a lot of problems. And I think that when we start looking at the cost of deploying it, like an AI model, like, a Mythos class model, versus saying, what was my SaaS and DaaS vendors, charging me? Maybe that wasn't such a bad deal after all, right?
Maybe it wasn't outlandish.
Yes, exactly. And I think that, like, same with supply chain stuff, right? This has always existed, and there's been a number of people across industry, right? And there's some companies and startups that have looked at, like, all right, how do we scan, new JavaScript and Python packages as they come in? And, how do we have, like, an internal trusted repo, for instance? And that's all sort of become because there's been this huge reliance on the open source ecosystem. And also that ecosystem has just been flooded since, like, with AI models, whether you want to, like, some of it is, slop, whether it's, pull requests, feature requests, bug fixes, vulnerability, like, bug bounty things. Like, there's just been this sort of, like, a system that was basically already propped up by volunteers and people doing this as, like, passion projects on the side is now just getting, like, hit on all sides. So I think it's kind of just pushed something that was a risk, but didn't have as much visibility just to like an absolute forefront and to the breaking point, because now we have to start considering, all right, like Claude Code, anti-gravity codecs, we'll download and like run and just import specific libraries. So this isn't even like, hey, I as a developer need to go and like pull something in or whatever. Like Claude with skills, same with any of these. If you give it like the more dynamic access you give it, the more it can just pull in and execute any code that's there. So that's why you don't even have to go in and like accidentally say, oh, did we import this, right? Is this in our software bill of materials that for the software we build? It's that, all right, these agents and things that we're using are, again, to make them more useful, going and pulling libraries and code and things from the internet. And how do we scan that without, again, introducing this huge latency that makes it like, okay, like this isn't useful, right? I'm sitting here, I've got to wait until it finishes, scanning and going through all the steps. Although I do think like we have not made any of those trade-offs yet, I really feel. And I think there are going to be some we have to make.
Yep. And your point about visibility here was kind of an interesting thought process. Is cybersecurity has always been looked at, as like a secondary or a tertiary, like at best kind of thing, right? It's like, no, making money first, that's what matters, and then we'll figure the rest out. I think AI has really changed that, and it's brought security truly into like being a household thought or topic now, because it's not just companies, big organizations that are having to think about security. Anybody's kid, mom, dad, grandmom can sit on their couch now and make a new application or start a business around it or do all of these little things because AI is enabling it. But these same problems that have historically affected us as security practitioners are now affecting your grandmom, your kids, because all of a sudden now all of their devices are able to potentially be targeted or have a problem, or just so many other little things because of these supply chain attacks or potentialist, malicious skills, and just maybe the AI going, you know what, I'm hallucinating today and doing something crazy it isn't typically allowed to do. So seeing all of that now, there's a much broader impact because it's not just, oh, Target got breached. It's, oh, that problem is something I'm using, and these end users don't know how to properly, vet these packages. They don't understand what most of them are doing. They just know the AI said they need to use it to make their thing work. So that's what they're running with.
Yeah.
It's really an interesting time when it comes to this stuff.
Yeah, I think vibe coding and some of that, like, I think it's kind of like there's a couple of elements of it, right? I think it's really interesting and cool to see that people are able to sort of bring out ideas that would have either died or never sort of made it before. But I think like with that, there's a couple of pieces that I do think there are specific parts of the current vibe coding paradigm that are going to shift because we are in sort of a transition period, right? Where people are just kind of experimenting widely, and there's not sort of a standard around, all right, what is moat anymore? Because that's the thing you hear, Wall Street talk about the SaaS apocalypse and all this stuff. But at the end of the day, like the code is only a part of why businesses are valued at what they are. And I think like the expertise and some of that stuff, like, an example we've used in lots of conversations is around like, CRMs, right? And like Salesforce and HubSpot and some of those, it's like you can vibe code a CRM of some sort in a very quick time frame. And with Gemini 3.5 was released this week, it's very fast. And so it's like, cool, maybe let's say 5 minutes, I could build a CRM. That doesn't mean I'm a Salesforce competitor, right? Like realistically, like that's the thing. There's like the features and the function and some of that stuff. Those are part of it, but getting the customers, building the trust, like the human relationships, like those are all part of the business as well. And I think that's the piece that like I think we will gravitate towards, and we're already seeing this, right? If you can start like picking out when Claude and stuff like that has built a website because it uses a very like it's good, it's better than the default was before of like design languages and stuff like that. So you still have some customization, but I think what we're seeing is the floor's raising on like what what a business and what some of that stuff, like the expectations nowadays are going to be, okay, that minimum bar isn't just that you registered something and maybe made a Facebook, thing. It's that, all right, you at least had, something vibe code your website, and it needs to look kind of good. It needs to have these pieces on it. And so, but what I think it'll gravitate towards, and I think the winners in this area are going to be the folks that can provide sort of the like back end infrastructure that is much harder, that is more of a moat, and like that has security and some of that stuff baked in, right? Because look at HTTPS, look at some of this stuff, like it takes time. Nothing in security happens overnight. But I think like there is, I'll say positive, like I see optimism, in my sense on the horizon of like how I think that will go, because people are going to be concerned about, hey, I want to vibe code my application, but I don't want to have to worry about security, right? And I want to be able to click a box to say I pay an extra $2 or $5 or whatever on checkout, that, and say like I want security included per month. And so
there's a new market right there.
Yeah, yes. I absolutely think like and I think Lovable and some of those are essentially like I have to imagine they're tackling some of that right now, because as the consumer like expectation shifts, right? If all your customers start, getting, having their customers popped and all of this stuff, and there's all these lawsuits that come out, right, out of essentially vibe coded apps, then the risk tolerance shifts. And we just haven't seen that breaking point quite yet. But I do think it's coming.
Awesome. This has been an awesome conversation today, Tim. We actually ran a little over than we want to. That's always a good sign, right?
Yeah.
It's been awesome to have you on. Thanks for taking the time to chat with us today.
All right. Thanks, Trey. Thanks for having me.
Say for all you guys that hung out and attended, thanks for being here. We guys will catch you on the next Threat Thursday.